a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hi, this is Peter Hart's Military History, and that's me. And today I'm joined as ever with my good friend and colleague Gary Bain. Hi, Gary.
Hello, Peter. How are you?
Oh, very well. And we've had a change of venue. This time we're at Chez Bain. And I must admit, when you said we were going to record it in the smallest room in the house, I didn't realise you meant the latrines, Gary. But what a latrine! I mean, you said you were well off, and I know the difference between a historian and a top executive at Transport for London. But yeah, I've never actually seen gold taps before. I mean, that's pretty wonderful.
Yeah, unfortunately, they're just gold-plated.
So you say. Anyway, to the history. What are we doing today, Gary? What are we doing? What should we do?
Well, today we're talking about the Battle of Mons, that fantastic engagement that is well known as the British Army's massive confrontation with the whole German army. Yes. In some ways, it's presented as a British David against the German Goliath. The teeming hordes of Germans against our plucky, brave lads, and it's painted often as a British victory. Well, we don't agree with that, do we, Gary? Not really. No, not at all.
There's aspects of it. There's the courage of the British infantry, courage of the German infantry as well. But there's the forgotten force in all of it, which is the French. And we'll be covering what they're doing during the battle in outline. And we'll just have a look at the battle and see whether it matches up to this myth of this titanic battle. Because I'm not sure it does. So where should we start? Where would you like to start, Gary?
Well, why were we committed to a land force in the first place, Peter? Why were we there?
Well, that's interesting. You've got to put it in context because we had always been opponents of the French and the Russians, but the Germans had managed to annoy everybody. That's strange, that. And the politicians had created the Anglo-French Entente and then the Triple Alliance. And the French were pretty clever, or I think they were, because they sort of inveigled Britain into promising to send land forces. Now, at the root of the original agreement, we said we'd protect their Atlantic and Channel coast. You know, the Royal Navy would protect their coast, and they'd deal with the Mediterranean. But when it actually came to it, that's not, you know, the French wanted more. And you can understand why, because they're facing the German army that had beaten them in 1870 and stealing the provinces of stealing is perhaps over the top, but taking the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine. And the French were aware of the power of the German army, and they wanted all the help they could get. So they sort of came to the British. And it's quite an interesting process as to how they did it.
So we've got a land force there. We're busily moving forward, presumably not knowing where the Germans were, or indeed the size of the German army. Well,
we'd better talk about the size of the German army, because we're like tiddlers, little tiny tiddlers in a great big sea. I mean, we've got about 120, 250,000 at most people in the British Army, you know, the regulars. Regulars are the professional regular soldiers. The French and German armies are massive conscript armies. And they've both got about 3 million men. And it, you know, and if you put it in divisions, we have 4 divisions ready. 4 divisions, that's all. And the French, the Germans have 68 divisions facing the French and Belgian and British armies. The French have 75, and we've got 4. We have got another 2, but being British, they were a bit behind schedule, a couple of problems sorting it all out, you know, so there was originally only 4. And so, you know, that's not very many. But the French had a plan, and the French were clever. You know, and one man in particular summed it up, and I love this quote. It's from Ferdinand Foch. It's off the top of my head, but basically he's saying, "You just send one. How many men do you want us to send? Well, just send one, and we'll make absolutely bloody sure he's killed." In other words, to drag the British into the war, because once one was killed, it sort of sucks us all in. So the French, whilst not happy with 4 and later 6 and divisions, knew that what would happen, and eventually we have 60-odd divisions on the Western Front. So Foch was right. But what happens? Well, we arrived late. We always seem to arrive a bit late. I mean, the Germans had invaded Belgium back on the 1st of August, I think, and we were required to come to their help on the left of the French army. Should we talk about what the German and French plans were? Do you know? Okay.
Yeah, so it strikes me, and perhaps you have a different view, but the French seemed to be totally obsessed with Alsace-Lorraine.
Yes, I think that's right. Their plan is called Plan 17, which indicates to my mind there's been about 16 before it, but that's the sort of skillful thinking you get from a professional historian. But Plan 17 was basically a charge into Alsace-Lorraine. The French were, the commander-in-chief was Joseph Joffre, and he basically would put 4 huge, gigantic armies along the German, Luxembourg and Belgian armies, intent on driving into Alsace-Lorraine and reclaiming it for France. You know, it's always been contested territory.
And the Germans knew that, didn't they?
The Germans knew that. They just intended to block them there. And then their plan was I can never pronounce it, Schlieffen plan. I wish I was a real grody-up historian and could pronounce things properly, but I can't. And it was tweaked by the German CNC, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger. He wasn't CNC, he was a chief of chief of German staff, you know. One of those bit people with different sized heads to us, Gary. And his plan was to a huge right wing which would smash through Belgium, through the Liège fortresses, and then keep going round close to the coast, hammer through Belgium, and then sweep down into northern France. Another army would break through the Belgian Ardennes reach. Two others would push through Luxembourg and the French Ardennes. So you have 5 huge armies in a single wheeling manner. So if you put your elbow up and move it round, the hand is the first and second, and then the other armies are the main body of the arm.
And forgive me, I'm paraphrasing, but was it not Schlieffen on his deathbed is reported to have said, "Keep the right arm strong"?
That's the legend. Now the Schlieffen plan has become very, very controversial as a result of the work of some historians who've just basically said it never existed. I'm not an expert on German things. I mean, why pretend to know things you don't? I don't know whether it existed in a formal plan form, but it is what the Germans did, and it is what their operational plans were built on. And the idea was there was this smashing blow coming through Belgium, the right wing. And we, the British, the mighty 4 divisions, would be on the left of the French line. In other words, the ones facing the German first and second armies as they came through, sweeping round. Who commanded our forces? Well, this is quite interesting. Always confuses me. French commanded our forces. Field Marshal Sir John French. Now, I used to think he was a bit of an idiot. As you get older, you start to realise that what's happened is he's probably past his sell-by date. He'd been a thrusting and seemingly intelligent cavalry officer. He'd done reasonably well in the Boer War. His performance in 1914 has given him a bad reputation. We'll return to that. His British Expeditionary Force, notice it's a force, not an army, because it isn't an army. It's just 4 divisions. One corps had 2 divisions, first and second, I think. I'd imagine so, knowing the British. And that was commanded by Lieutenant General Douglas Haig, the educated soldier and later on the commander of the whole of the Western Front. Second Corps was commanded by Lieutenant General Sir James Grayson.
Sorry? I've never heard of Sir James Grayson.
No, you won't have done, Gary. And the fact that you brought this because what happened to him? Now, he was a very competent general, had outmanoeuvred Haig in the 1912 manoeuvres, was a promising figure. By no means anybody's inferior. But there was one thing wrong with him, Gary. Guess what that might be?
I have no idea, Peter.
You're looking worried, Gary. Well, the thing is, on the first day, they got to France on the 16th, 17th of August, and on that night, he had a fatal heart attack. Now, why do you think that might have been, Gary?
He was probably a large gentleman.
A large gentleman who enjoyed food and drinking, much akin to your good self, Gary. I notice you've put on another few pounds since our last meeting.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes. Anyway, I'm sure the diet will kick in one day or another. Anyway, so James Grayson died 17th of August. I mean, and he was immediately replaced by Major General Sir Horace Smith Dorian. Now, he's an interesting chap. He is interesting. One thing I like about him is he's bad-tempered. He is a bad-tempered sod. And I just like that. I don't like all this nicey business. And Horace Smith Dorian would tell you to piss off as soon as look at you, basically. I mean, he didn't suffer fools at all. He might kind of go. He also, one of the other interesting things about him is that he was one of the very few to survive the disastrous Battle of Isandlwana against the Zulus on the 22nd of January 1879. A date I remember because I've written it down in a little note I have in front of me, because I knew I wouldn't remember that, and I didn't. And people often wonder how he escaped.
Yeah, was he was one of the cavalry officers, wasn't he?
No. He left early, I think. Very wise. I'm not saying he ran away, but I'm saying he left in good time, and I would admire him for that.
Very perceptive of him.
Yeah, very perceptive. He could tell what was going wrong. So what's happening? So the British are on the left of the French line. Next to them is the French Fifth Army, commanded by a chap called Lanrezac. Again, a word, it's just ridiculous that I can't pronounce things.
Sorry, so just from my understanding, so you've got the French Fifth Army, then you've got First Corps under Haig.
Yes.
And then Second Corps on the extreme left.
Under Smith Dorian. There are some French territorials and cavalry beyond, but they don't really feature in the story. And the Fifth Army is General Charles Lanrezac. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's ridiculous that I can't pronounce it.
That was perfect.
You don't know. Anyway, now the Fifth Army is a proper army. It's got 15 divisions, but they're facing the Fifth Army and the British Expeditionary Force, the little tiddlers, are facing. Lanrezac is facing 38 divisions of the German Second and Third Army, and the First Army is going round, and they're the ones that are crashing down on the British.
And that's under von Kluck.
Von Kluck is the famous one. We always remember his name because to the British ear it's funny. You know, I'm sure the Germans find lots funny about us, especially at the moment, current political circumstances. Now, Joffre did not realise what was happening. I mean, later on he performs brilliantly, and we get the whole Battle of the Mons, but that's not happening yet. At the start, Joffre, not the slightest clue what's going on. He's concentrating on Alsace-Lorraine, and he has two armies ready to possibly move and counter the Germans, but he's not really doing anything about it. He has no idea of the trouble that Lanrezac, the Fifth Army, is in. Do other historians have problems pronouncing things? They don't seem to. I listen to podcasts with Matt McLachlan on, and he insists his name's pronounced McLachlan. I mean, come on. That just shows you the scale of the problem. Anyway, so what happens is that the French thrust basically is held, because the Germans hold them, and there's a huge battle of the frontiers smashing on in the whole Ardennes area. And I want to point this out because I'll forget. In this battle of the frontiers going on around 22nd, 23rd, this period of August, the French suffer some 200,000 casualties, of which 75,000 are dead. And on one day alone, the 22nd of August, the day before the mighty Battle of Mons, the French had 27,000 fatalities, dead. Not wounded. That is nearly twice what. Well, it's 17,000 more than we lost on the first day of the Somme.
Yeah, it's rather intriguing, isn't it? Because that's not a very well-known fact, and yet a big issue. The British make a huge issue of the losses on the Somme, and the French suffered that sort of loss on one day.
22nd of August. Yeah, I mean,
incredible.
It is incredible, and it gives you an idea of the scale of the fighting and the scale of the French sacrifice, and the very idea that the French run away or can't face the Germans. It's two huge armies smashing into each other, and the Germans get the better of it. They just do.
So tell me a little bit about the British Army then, Peter, if I may. So what was so special about the British infantrymen that the French were desperate to have us involved?
Well, firstly, to the French, it's just tokenism to bring in a mass force. But the other thing about the British is that they're hardened regulars. And you can go too far with all this, but the much-quoted figure, if they could fire with their Lee Enfield rifles 15 rounds a minute, all of them. Many could fire more than that, and there's a historian called Taft Gillingham, who I saw demonstrate firing 20, and he's not a soldier. In fact, he's a little overweight, like your good self, Gary. And Taft, that just shows you what can be done. I'm not sure whether other troops couldn't fire that fast as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, was that unique to the British soldier?
It was very good. I'm not sure, they'd also learnt accuracy. There'd been a bit of a cult of accuracy. So I think it would be, you could generally say that British musketry, as they used to call it, was better than anybody else's. I think that's a fair comment. But there are some problems with other things which will emerge during the battle. So if we could leave some of the flaws, for the moment, the infantry, good. As far as it goes as individual personal skills. Now, where are we with the situation? Let's look at that. The French cavalry, the British cavalry crossed the border on the 21st of August, across the Franco-Belgian border, and they're screening the advance of the British Expedition Force, BEF, from now on.
So that would be traditionally called a sort of advance to contact.
Yeah, they're pushing forward. They don't really know what's happening. Now, up above them is a new thing. Now, one of the podcasts very soon will deal with the 1914 War in the Air, and so I'm not going to go into detail. But one quote, just to give a flavour, and this is from Lieutenant Cuthbert Rabagliati. Here we go again. Oh, it's a 5 Squadron Royal Flying Corps. Now, just read this quote. He had a map strapped on one knee. So it's him. I had a map strapped on one knee and a pad with a pencil on the other, and it was rather wobbling about. As soon as we got over our area, instead of seeing a few odd German troops, I saw the whole area covered with hordes of field grey uniforms, advancing infantry, cavalry, transport and guns. The place was alive with the Germans. My pilot and I were completely astounded because it was not a little more than we'd been looking for. It was infinitely more. We came roaring back and we landed, whereupon I was put into a motor car by my squadron commander and taken off to General Headquarters.
So, sorry, why did General Headquarters then not know the Germans were coming in that sort of magnitude?
It's beyond belief in some ways, isn't it, Gary? Because what happens is people like French, they're more interested in the pilot. And so what's an aeroplane like, young man? Oh, you're obviously mistaken. They just didn't believe the reports. And this is despite the fact that there were other reports that they were coming. There was cavalry reconnaissance reports were starting to feed in. There's one officer had rung every railway station to see whether the Germans were there. That's my kind of officer. Don't go forward yourself. Just sit in a phone and ring people up. But Field Marshal French seems to have no grip on it. He can't get it into his head that he's facing his little tiny four division 2-corps army are facing the First Army, the whole German First Army. And this is what Lieutenant General Horace Smith Dorian, so he's the one in charge of 2 corps, he's the one who in the end will face the bulk of First Army, he says this: about 6 a.m. the chief, i.e. French, Sir John French, appeared at my headquarters and, addressing his corps and cavalry division commanders assembled there, told us that little more than 1 or at most 2 enemy corps, with perhaps a cavalry division, were facing the BEF. So it was evident that he too was in blissful ignorance of the real situation. Sir John was in excellent form and told us to be prepared to move forward or to fight where we were, but to get ready for the latter by strengthening our outposts and preparing the bridges over the canal for demolition. This is the Mons Condé Canal, which is Mons, is hence the name Battle of Mons. Now, he has no sense of... You'll notice he has no sense of the reality of the situation there. He just doesn't know what's happening. For a start, even if he'd been right and it was only 1 or at most 2 enemy corps, the corps are much bigger than him. You know, he's just not got... He doesn't know what's going on.
So, was there anything wrong with the British Second Corps dispositions around the Mons Condé Canal then?
Well, that's what it's an interesting area. That's a good question, Gary, because there is. Although I'm not harsh on Smith Dorian, there's a laissez-faire attitude from Sir John French, which is appalling. No control, no grip, no nothing. It's poor old Horace, a good personal friend of mine, of course. Smith Dorian was left on his Todd. Now, it's a coal mining region, and there's the canal running. It runs along in front of where the British take up a line behind, and it goes in a loop round the town of Mons itself, and that forms a sort of salient. And we're going to all basically occupy that canal line. Lots and lots of little tiny pit villages, slag heaps, lots of slag heaps, like Northern Britain used to be when we had a coal mining industry. The Second Corps would be along this line. Now, the First Corps was out of it in a sense, because it was in a line but bending back to maintain contact with the French Fifth Army. And if it didn't do that, the Germans could pour through that gap. So, Haig's First Corps is not performing a glamorous or dramatic role, but if it didn't perform it, all hell could break loose. If the British were separated from the French, it could be an absolute disaster. So he's doing his job, but you don't hear much about Haig. It's not Haig's battle, it's not the First Corps' battle. Now, Smith Dorian puts his 3rd Division on the right of the line in that loop round Mons. So he's occupied. They're occupying that, and the 5th Division, his other division, are on the left. So he's got that shows it's the 3rd and 5th in that division. Now, what's interesting is how there's one big mistake, and that is he puts all his troops in a line. He doesn't have a reserve. Now, why does that matter?
Well, that matters because if there's a breakthrough, there's nothing you can do about it, and they're very thinly spread. So there's no reserve.
And that means that, in effect, Smith Dorian has also removed himself from the battle, because if you haven't got a reserve, how do you affect things? All you can do is tell them when to retreat.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, if someone breaks through, what do you do? Because all your troops are in a line. And there's another problem. The guns, the artillery. Now, we had a fixation with field artillery. The Boer War had taught us it was important to have fast-moving guns. So we had 18-pounders, 4.5-inch howitzers, the field artillery. We didn't have any heavy artillery. But the trouble is that we couldn't find where to put our guns. The ground is not suitable. The fields of fire are poor. It's difficult to move the guns about because the terrain, close fields, blasted pit heaps, streams. It's just difficult. And one last thing wrong with the dispositions is the bridges. Now,
yeah, why not blow the bridges? That would be the first thing you'd do, wouldn't it?
Because we still had dreams of resuming our advance. This is typically British. You wouldn't find the Germans doing this. Well, not often anyway. I mean, the British think, we might need that bridge. The Germans are bloody need it for sure. So we hadn't made proper arrangements, and I'll pop back to that. Remind me to pop back to that as we go through the battle. So Kluck, the General Alexander, to give him his first name, Alexander von Kluck, commanding the First Army. So that's who's facing us. Now, he's also in a position of disadvantage because he doesn't know what's happening either. Now, I'm sure he's getting reports from his... but the German cavalry... There's a whole book on it by a chap called Dennis Showalter and others, Robinson, that goes into this. But the German cavalry wasn't performing well. But the one thing that Kluck had in his favour is it's a proper army. It's not a force. It's an army. So there are 142 battalions of infantry.
And all well trained?
Well trained, ready for war. 32 cavalry squadrons attached, 110 batteries of artillery. This is a proper army. It's not a pretend army. It's not a 4-division army as the BEF was. Two more would arrive later on during Locato and the rest of it. But for the moment, we're a 4-division things. The Germans had learned from their manoeuvres, and they had more space to manoeuvre, to carry out big field manoeuvres. And although they didn't, for instance, their cavalry always finished with a massive cavalry charge and tea and buttered scones, or the German equivalent of buttered bratwurst sausages. Tea and bratwurst sausage sounds great. Actually, I just fancy that. Should we stop this for a moment? They'd learnt, and so, for instance, instead of having 2 machine guns battalion, the Germans only had 2 per battalion as well, but they brigaded them. So they got them, 2 from each battalion, and put them into a machine gun company, which was then deployed as a tactically significant force to provide serious amounts of machine gun fire, to provide a sort of hail of machine gun bullets. They also had more artillery. They were more used to cooperating with their artillery. Their field guns were bigger and not necessarily better. They had more medium guns. They were better at the all-arms battle. It wasn't the all-arms, but at least their artillery, infantry, and machine guns were acting together.
And presumably they used it, unlike us being unable to deploy our artillery. They presumably used this.
They managed to deploy it better, is I think the expression. I'm not sure they particularly had it in early enough, but when they did deploy it. So we come to the Battle of Mons itself on the 23rd of August. Remember, this follows the huge Battle of the Frontiers on the 22nd and the 27,000 dead Frenchmen. So let's keep this in context. It's an old-fashioned advance to contact, as you said, Gary. That's what it is. And what's happening is, again, we have to deploy. The Germans, so if you think of a pivot of your elbow and then you swing your arm, that's what it's like. So as each of the divisions in your arm, as they move round, they come in contact with the British line. So it's a sort of biff, 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 biff. It's not one attack. It's sequential attacks going from the right of the line round Mons itself, as the line approaches the canal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. So you have this perhaps myth of the Germans attacking as mass hordes. So they're not doing that. They're attacking sequentially, but it appears to the British as if they're facing this mass horde.
Well, as each force in the thing arrives, they will deploy. They deploy in a fairly standard German way. And for this, I'm indebted to people like Terence Zuber, who I don't entirely agree with all the time, and I'm sure he doesn't bloody agree with me either. That's fair enough. And a great British historian who's been enormously helpful to a lot of us historians, Jack Sheldon, or Colonel Jack Sheldon. Give him his Sunday name. They pointed out much that the Germans didn't do these mass attacks. So what they did was they deployed in skirmish lines, they won the firefight, then they'd send in lines of infantry, much akin to the British on the Somme, but from behind, I suppose if you're in line in your defence and lying down and you look and you see 4 lines of infantry coming towards you, it looks like they're in a mass. I don't know what it is. Anyway, the British are in thin defensive positions. They have outposts the other side of the canal, and then they've got shallow, scraped-out trenches, often only with their entrenching tools, and they've fortified miners' cottages. Bashed holes in the walls, just like in Napoleonic days, like Hougoumont. Remember when we went to Hougoumont? And that's what they did there along that wall and then inside. So that, improvised barricades across the narrow streets, that kind of stuff. But let's talk about the most interesting point is right on the right, the apex of the salient round Mons, where it bends round, is where the 8th and 9th Brigades were. And I'm going to talk about the 4th Royal Fusiliers, because everybody does, so I might as well. And there, they've got positions, and they put their 2 machine guns under Lieutenant Dees on the bridge. Godley and Dees, they'd win the first VCs. Incredibly brave men, but not very well placed machine guns. They were obviously located in the bridge. They weren't concealed or to the flank. Machine gun fire is more effective from the flank.
So they weren't positioned to enfilade them?
No, and that's what you try. Always with machine guns, you don't want them charging towards you. You want to catch them in enfilade so that they have to run across a stream of bullets. And it's just much more effective that way. No concept of that. They were in the ideal place to be rushed, of course, because they were on a bridge. They were in plain view, not concealed. It's not great. It's just, it made them vulnerable to capture. And, the Germans start to attack. And it's what I said. They start to build up their attack. First the skirmishers firing. Then you get more and more infantry coming in, building up a solid amount of rifle fire. Then they deploy the machine guns. But the British, when they try and attack, the Germans try and attack, the British deploy their 15 rounds a minute, and this is it's quite close by at Oberg is Lance Corporal Alfred Vivian of the 4th Middlesex Regiment. And this quote is absolutely typical of what you were talking about earlier, Garrett, which is this idea of the attack like Napoleonic, like we saw all those diagrams and pictures at Waterloo, just like that. Anyway, this is what Lance Corporal Alfred Vivian says. Rapid fire! That solid-looking field grey wall was blasted away by the hail that leapt at them through the hedge as powerful rifles, manipulated by men who in pre-war days depended on their skill at this exercise for their pay. They got extra money for marksmanship badges. Pumped steel-jacketed leaden death into them with never a miss at the rate of at least 15 rounds a minute per man. No troops on earth could have faced that murderous blast and existed. And within less than a minute of the order to fire, the only signs left of this futile attack and of the terrible lesson that the enemy had been taught were the numerous grey-clad figures that littered the ground between our hedge and the wood from which the enemy had launched his attack. Another calm period ensued, broken only by the pitiful cries of the wounded foe who had been left lying, abandoned, out upon the blood-soaked field. This is the myth of Mons. Thousands of Germans being shot down by our brave lads who fight on, all this. The German casualties are excruciating. But it's not true. They're advancing in short bounds. They rise in skirmish lines. They run forward under covering fire from other German troops and the machine guns, and then drop back down to earth. They're not advancing in a solid wall or phalanx. They're not. And when they drop to the ground, they're taking cover. A lot of them, apparently, Now, there's this other myth, and you may have heard of it, that they thought everybody had a machine gun. Have you heard that one?
Yeah, there's a number of myths. If you leave the rather extreme ones to one side, but there is a myth that the Germans thought they were facing machine gun fire, when in fact it was the British infantrymen's 15 aimed rounds per minute.
Well, and the thing is that's one of the things that the British are famous for doing. We are famous for saying what other people think of us. And there are many, many examples, but you can't actually find the Germans saying that. The Germans are respectful of our infantry, but they don't think there's hordes of machine guns facing them. There's no evidence for that at all. They think they're under fire from bloody bastards who could shoot straight and fast. It's like we say we've got the best goalkeeper in the world, when normally we haven't got the best goalkeeper in the Premiership. It's like we say we've got the best post office in the world. People, what?
Given our comments earlier about the size of the battle compared to what was going on in the frontier regions with the French, one of the myths is the level of casualties we inflicted upon the Germans. I've heard it range anywhere from sort of 10,000 to 20,000 casualties.
Absolutely, and I'm going to hold that because I'm really pleased you raised that because I want people to be thinking how many casualties. Remembering that it was 27,000 dead. So how many casualties? You know, I mean, is it 5,000 dead or what? We'll just bear this in mind. Let's be thinking, wow, that we're firing so fast. How many are we killing? What are our own casualties? What's going on? And that's a great point to keep. What happens is that as the battle comes, as each German regiment comes into line along the canal, what happens to the Royal Fusiliers, back to them, 4th Royal Fusiliers, happens to all of them. And here we are, Lieutenant Kinglake Tower, and he sums it up. Notice, see if you can pick out what's key in what he says. Guns had now been brought up, and the deafening crashes of the shrapnel shells bursting on top of us was added to the continuous roar of rifle fire. Heavy shells were falling in the town of Mons about a mile behind us, and I remember seeing a church tower collapse and fall into the street. The enemy was getting closer and closer to us, and had begun to bring massed machine gun fire to bear on our slender parapets on the canal bank. The dead and dying were lying all over the place. So what do you notice there?
Well, the two things that we mentioned earlier, guns, artillery, and concentrated machine gun fire.
That's it. And this is the Germans are more skillful at deploying the nitty-gritty, what they needed. And as they come, they get across the canal. Yes, they're held up, but as each German regiment comes into line, they defeat the British opposite them. Sure, they have some casualties, but they get across. Now, we also fail, absolutely fail to blow the bridges. And the poor old Royal Engineers, there's not enough officers. There's too many bridges. Royal Engineer officers, sapper officers are rare. There's not many of them. So you've got Lance Corporals, and you all know what Lance Corporals can be like, being sent off to blow a bridge up. They don't know what's happening. They don't know whether they should blow the bridge or wait. Are we blowing it now? Who's telling us to blow it up? What's the order? What's the chain of command here? I'm a Lance Corporal. When do I blow this bloody bridge up? Because it's difficult to unblow it.
So they had actually prepared the bridges.
Mostly, yeah. But not, but they had not always. Because there was another problem. They often had. They didn't have the right firing apparatus. They lacked safety fuses. In some cases, they didn't have the right explosives. And so, even when they did blow them up, the German war machine is such that they had temporary pontoon bridges soon deployed. That's the sort of thing that happens. Now, there was one attack further along the canal, away from the salient, where one German regiment gets smashed up. And I want to read that German quote because it's crucial to understanding it. It's by Captain Walter Bloem of the 2nd 12th Grenadier Regiment. And he says this: "We had no sooner left the edge of the wood than a volley of bullets whistled past our noses and cracking into the trees behind. 5 or 6 cries near me. 5 or 6 of my grey lads collapsed in the grass. Damn it! This was serious. The firing seemed at long range and half left. Forward, I shouted, taking my place with 3 of my staff, 10 paces in front of the section leader, Holder Egger, and the section in well-extended formation, 10 paces behind him again. Here we were, advancing as if on a parade ground. Hüt, bullets sound different in German, that's one thing I learned. About our ears, away in front of a sharp, rapid hammering sound. Then a pause, then more rapid hammering. Machine guns. Over to our left, the rifle and machine gun fire was even more intense. The roar of guns and bursting shells increasing. A real battle this time. And they did suffer a lot of casualties. But Walter Bloem is a journalist. A novelist. He writes fiction. And he does exaggerate. This is the worst casualties the Germans suffer, and even in his quote he mentions they advanced in well extended formation. So that's not a phalanx, is it? And they also, which he doesn't mention, they were facing the Royal Artillery had managed to deploy 2 guns up by the canal towpath on this one. So they were featuring artillery. The 3 battalions of the 12th Infantry Regiment, the Germans, suffered some 600 casualties, which would be about 200 dead. But that, they're still, it's nowhere near the fantasy figures. So as each one comes into line, the British resistance collapses. Bravery, but there's the German tactics, the resources they deploy are too good for us, and we start to fall back. Captain Beauchamp Tudor St. John, 1st Northumberland Fusiliers, said this retirement was one of the most exhausting things I remember. We had no time to waste, and my job was to post covering parties. We had to defend every street corner until a column had turned the succeeding corner, and the result was that by the time I placed one post, I had to run on and catch the column up and tell it off and pace the next. I would have given my kingdom for a horse, and no mistake. So we were falling back by this time. Now, is this a victory?
Doesn't sound like one, does it?
No. Is there any victory involved? Is there a tactical victory somewhere involved? We hold them up for probably the minimum you'd expect, given the.
Yeah, but isn't the British psyche, the victory's in the fact that it is the David versus Goliath, and hence, perhaps we've overemphasised the importance of the action at Mons as a result. Our tiny little force held up von Kluck's First Army.
It's what we like to think. It did hold them up a bit, but what really confused was that Kluck had no idea what was happening still, and he didn't really know what was happening or where we'd gone. and his men were getting tired. And one thing about that is, if you're advancing in swinging, where would you want to be on that line of advancing troops?
You want to be at the apex where your elbow is, Pete.
Yes, you want to be at the elbow where you're going a little tiny way. But if you're right up by my fingertips, you're going a bloody long way and you get knackered.
Yeah.
So his troops were started to get knackered. Von Kluck doesn't really impact on the battle. It's just an advance to contact. Nothing much happens for him. Sir John French, worse. Almost as if he was deliberately keeping out of it. Haig sent some help to Smith Dorian. He was asked for 2 or 3 battalions, and he sent 2 or 3 battalions. He's given hell for not marching to the sound of the guns, but that would leave the gap that we discussed in between the French Fifth Army, commanded by that mystery general who we no longer name. It's just awful. So why do we fail? If we failed. Why isn't it a better story for the British? Well, we could fire 15 aim rounds a minute. How many did they carry?
Well, that's a very good question.
It is a bloody good question, because, I've been told by Taff, I've been told by all these experts how many times, time and time again, they've told me, and I can never remember. But it's between 150 and 220 rounds. 15 into, say, 220. How many is that then?
Well, it's about 20 minutes.
Excellent maths. Let's give it half an hour. You haven't got long to fire under these. It's not the greatest, and also the rifles get hot. They run out of ammunition. The Germans do suffer badly in places, but this is not the way to stop them. What happens also is the British are fighting as battalions. They're not fighting as brigades. There is no support brigade. There's no reserves. They fight. When there's a breakthrough, they've got no reserves to fill the gap or counterattack while the Germans are weak. Because the best time, if they take a bridge and get a bridgehead, the best time to hit them is in the first 20 minutes. If you leave it, they're going to be ready for you. The Royal Artillery was unable to deploy. But another thing, why didn't they fire indirect fire? Because they weren't very good at it. Because the Royal Artillery had some knowledge of firing indirectly with observers, to correct the fire and the range, but they weren't very good at it, and they weren't very keen on it, and they weren't able to use it. And all of this, there's just so many things go wrong, and we weren't outnumbered 12-1. That would be if every force in the First Army reached us. In actual fact, in the crucial areas like at Nimi Ridge, which is near
Nimi Bridge.
Nimi. Yeah, thank you. I'm getting very confused there. Nimi Bridge, which is on the salient area near Mons. That's a pinch point. Well, the odds there were 3-4-1. But the defenders did know the Germans had a lot more to come, so they knew they weren't going to be there long. So that doesn't help. You're going to have to fall back. I think as individuals, the British fought bravely and skillfully, But as far as it comes as fighting as a corps or a division or even a brigade, they just lack the ability. Now, ask me about casualties again.
Yeah, so my understanding is that, you know, the brave soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force lost about 1,600, I think.
So 1,638 casualties, that's not all dead.
And I think I've heard estimates of around 10,000 for the Germans.
Well, these are guesstimates, and that's the word, guesstimates, because what happens is they extrapolate from the Walter Bloom's regiment, the 12th Grenadier Sausages, and they extrapolate from that. Oh, well, it must have been the same everywhere. No, 10,000. But basically, they take a figure and double it. And then they double it again. And this is where you get people like Terence Zuber and Jack Sheldon have just gone through German casualties, especially Zuber has just been through, and then nothing like it. Absolutely. The casualties seem to have been, from Zuber's work, between 1,900 and 2,000. Not dead, but casualties. And normally it's a third dead, isn't it? Not, you know, so you'd say 600 or 700 dead. Now that's a lot, isn't it? I mean, now that would be a... God, how would we suffer it? But
and that's the attacking force, so you would expect that anyway. But very similar casualty levels to the British.
Yeah, 1,600 to 1,638. So that's also about 600 dead. So there you go, 600 dead, not 27,000 dead. That's the difference between one battle and another. The Battle of Mons is a brave action by the British. It's also a brave action by those Germans who are attacking across a canal against improvised defensive positions. That's not an easy task. They need guts and bravery and skill as well. But they deploy the extra weapons, the massed machine guns and the artillery to give them a crucial edge in securing a firepower advantage which lets them get across the bridges and it wins them the day. They do win. The fact that the next episode is called, not the podcast, but the next episode in the fighting is called the Great Retreat, Gary. That gives you the hint that all has not gone well. You know, you don't have the victorious Battle of Waterloo followed by the Great Retreat to Calais. Yeah. No. So that's it. I mean, how do you feel? Has it made you feel differently about Mons?
Yeah, I mean, I visited Mons very briefly. I found that I did actually think it was a very industrial place. It wasn't. It was quite dirty and you know, not sort of touristy at all. I went to Saint-Symphorion. It has made me feel different, but I've got a question. So, the Kaiser is attributed with this phrase, that contemptible little army. Is that from the action at Mons or the action from the retreat and subsequent actions that follow?
I think it was before that, and I think it was a threat. I mean, there's a whole... People have investigated very closely. Fundamentally, whether he said it or not, I don't know. But I do know we used it very effectively as propaganda. Both the GOPR lads, who do not like being called a contemptible little army, but also back home in the recruitment campaign and the rest of it. Because the British fought bravely at Mons, and they fight bravely at the next battles at Le Cateau. But the main thing to bear in mind is, whatever the British are doing, it's almost of no importance whatsoever compared to what the German and French are doing. They're slugging it out. They're like gigantic mountains slugging it out, whilst a small boy with a lollipop stood in the corner watching.
Thank you very much for that analogy, Peter.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Gary.
Cheers.